Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse.
Welcome back. This is my great pleasure to welcome again Akash Chougule. Akash is the president of the Foundation for Research and Equal Opportunity, or FREOPP. Today, we're going to discuss the mission of FREOPP, the importance of bipartisanship in policymaking, and the future of unions and social policy in America. He will share his insights on how to foster upward mobility, reform union, and address social issues affecting low-income Americans. So all incredibly important issues. Welcome back, Akash.
Thank you very much for having me again, Vera. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Ignoring the fact that we're fighting on the right and on the left for the survival of everything we believe. But, apart from that, everything's great. How are you?
Yeah, fantastic. We never run out of work and challenges, but that's
That
that's part of the
is
fun.
very, very true. So so you recently, like what, a year ago, became the head, the big boss at FREOPP. Can you tell us what FREOPP is?
Yeah, absolutely. So you and I have known each other for many years,
Mm-hmm.
mostly in my prior capacity at Americans for Prosperity. But in April of 2025, I became president of FREOPP, FREOPP, which is an acronym for the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. FREOPP is a classical liberal free market think tank founded in 2016 by Ovik Roy, who's I know a friend of yours in our movement. There are basically three things that make FREOPP unique. So, one, we're classical liberal, limited government think tank, like many of the organizations that you and I've worked with. So that's the first aspect. But the two others are really, I think, what sets FREOPP apart. The second is that we focus specifically on policies that uplift Americans on the bottom half of the socioeconomic ladder. So Americans below the median wealth or income in this country. So while philosophically we agree with many other kind of center right free market groups, we generally focus on a set of issues and a set of reforms that many of our friends don't necessarily focus on because we have this particular interest in uplifting folks at the bottom half. And then the third is that we generally try to work on policies that we believe can get bipartisan support. And there's a really practical reason for this. This isn't just because bipartisanship is nice in theory, but particularly at the federal level, you actually need bipartisan support to create sustainable law. As you know, Vero, to do almost anything in the U.S. Senate, you need 60 votes, with the exception of those, budget reconciliation, tax, and spending bills. But to really solve the biggest issues facing our country, the healthcare crisis, the immigration crisis, our federal spending issues, we need 60 votes in the Senate. 99 times out of 100, that means bipartisan support. And even at the state level, we do a lot of work at the state level at FREOPP. Bipartisan support creates more sustainable law that's less likely to seesaw as the political winds shift. And so that's really what our mission is. We do thought leadership, research, analysis. We're very, very hands on, as you know, from my background with lawmakers, both at the federal level and at the state level. And we focus on a variety of issues that we'll get into here where we think there's more thought leadership and strategy needed. Some of the issues that, quite frankly, just don't get enough attention, but are very, very important to our mission of upward mobility.
Yeah, it's like I actually never realized that you were so focused on the basically lower bottom half of the income distribution. So does it mean that you don't, for instance, like look at issues like the wealth tax, or do you do this but with the lens of how it ends up affecting lower income Americans?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think we would share the perspective of you and a lot of others in the
Yeah,
space
yeah.
on something like the wealth tax, but we take a slightly different approach to it, which is why is a wealth tax harmful? It disrupts a lot of incentives and systems of free enterprise that are necessary to uplift Americans on the bottom half.
Hmm.
And particularly in with the wealth tax and other proposals that we hear, frankly, from both sides, as you alluded to, so much of this stuff is done in the name of class warfare or because
Hmm.
it does something to serve folks on the bottom half.
Hmm.
And one of the things that FREOPP does is just truth tell the people on both sides say that that stuff is largely nonsense. That way of thinking about improving the lives of Americans on the bottom half simply is not correct, right? We don't improve the lives of Americans on the bottom half by shifting around pieces of the pie or, deck chairs on the Titanic. The way we shift, or excuse me, improve the lives of Americans on the bottom half is to grow the pie, create the opportunity to climb the socioeconomic ladder. That involves, the right public policy, the right economic incentives, and obviously helping people to make the right decisions that are necessary for upward mobility.
Yeah. And the other thing that I thought was interesting in what you said is the bipartisanship. So, people who've known me for a long time will know that I am actually have always disliked bipartisanship because my reasoning was like usually it makes government bigger. But with age, I've kind of come to realize that literally like nothing good will come out that is not done on a bipartisan basis for the things that are just basically like the most important things because they won't last if it's not done on a bipartisan basis. So for instance, like there will be no reform of Social Security that is going to be just basically like a one side you know policy option. They're going to have, and I may not like the final product, but it's going to be likely more stable and solve more problems than kind of the really partisan tweaking around the edges that is just and so and when you were talking, I was thinking that it is true that literally it is because right now Congress is so polarized and politically it's just it's unacceptable apparently to reach across the aisle that really they haven't done anything except through reconciliation.
Yeah. 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 But the thing is, both of your points are true, right? Which is a lot of the time, bipartisanship for bipartisanship's sake isn't good. They do a lot of bad stuff in a bipartisan nature. They spend too much money, they grow government in a bipartisan nature. But it is also true that to solve the biggest problems that we're
Hmm.
facing, they will have to be bipartisan. I wrote about this recently, which I can send to you, that the housing bill that Congress just passed, it
Yeah.
just became law. People can quibble with the details of that, but that was a bipartisan, well intentioned effort that we were broadly supportive of at FREOPP that deregulated the housing market. It was intended to increase the housing supply, something that you and I both agree on needs to be done by getting government out of the way.
And here
And,
bipartisanship actually made the bill much better,
and that's
right?
exactly what I wrote about. There are a few very specific reasons that bill turned out much better, but because of bipartisanship between
Can
the
you can
committee,
you can you can
yeah.
you
So
tell
let me
us?
give you a couple. So between the committee chairs, so French Hill on the House Financial Services Committee and the Democrat ranking member Maxine Waters, and then Tim Scott and Elizabeth Warren on the Senate Finance Committee, there was already a level of trust between those two, the Democrat and the Republican on each of those committees, that made the working relationship a lot more productive. Another piece of bipartisanship that came into play is both sides, for the most part, pretty much dropped most of their really, really controversial ideological things that pertain to that issue, right? So, for example,
Thing
Republicans largely avoided
institution.
bringing in, avoided bringing in labor mandates. We avoided topics like, rent control or government subsidization, Section 8, things like that. A lot of these really kind of partisan ideological issues were kept out of the bill to make it more likely to succeed. A third kind of tertiary factor as a result of the bipartisan consensus was that it didn't become a hot button media thing either, right? Media loves jumping on these like, knockdown, drag out partisan fights. That's what their incentives are. The fact that the media ignored this bill for so long gave it a longer runway to success. They started paying attention when it finally was, between the 6 or 7 most important members of Congress hashing out a final product. That means that bill made it a very long way, made a lot of back and forth progress before it became a media firestorm, which I think helped its odds of passage. Of course, there was a lot of grassroots, pent up demand in the country for Congress to do something about it, which helped. The president was broadly supportive, which helped as well. But all that to say, I think there are elements of that formula that will need to be replicated, and it won't be exactly like that. And we don't know when and how and what the makeup of the federal government will need to be as far as House, Senate, and the president. But if we're going to solve immigration, healthcare, spending, et cetera, it's going to have to be something like what we saw in this housing bill.
Yeah. And it's like when I a few months maybe it's last year, I can't remember. But I talked with Yuval Levin when he had written his really great book about the Constitution. And I had like literally just kind of had failed to understand that some of the things that one of the things that is really actually so awesome, freaking awesome about the Constitution is kind of like built in the process is this notion that you actually need to broaden consensus before something can pass. And I was kind of like, when I read it, I was kind of, I was, it just basically, it was like this moment where I was kind of like, well, that's what we call bipartisanship, right? And it is a good thing, right? It's especially because we live in a moment where we're literally not in a bipartisan moment, and where like everything is decided was just super, super, super narrow majority that they're like they're not even trying to kind of get approval from the other side. So it means that there's just like for every particular issue you think about, it excludes. I mean, it goes against the will of probably enormous amount of voters.
Half the
And
country, right?
yeah, exactly. I mean, it is really now, it could be that half of the country is against it just because of who's doing it and if they actually thought about it. But nonetheless, right? I just kind of, and so I remember this like the first time where I thought, well, my kind of profound dislike of bipartisanship, which I mean, I think is like from a free market perspective, right? Actually, bipartisanship, like the outcome is rarely like a raging kind of libertarian ideal or even free market ideal. But it's kind of like I fail to appreciate kind of how important it was.
Yeah, I think, and Yuval's done incredible work on this. The thing that he writes a lot about and talks a lot about are the coalitions that are necessary
Yeah.
to create a majority, right? And it's very, very rarely just, oh, you build a majority of 50 plus 1% because you have a majority in Congress or a majority of the American people. Even the two parties, right? They're made up of these various factions. You've just think of the Republicans, right? You've got fiscal conservatives, you've got sort of the cultural social conservatives where that's their big priority. You've got the defense hawks. So you've got the moderate, kind of like purple state, purple
Mhm.
district majority makers, as folks might call them. So these like various factions within a party matter a lot. And then if you're going to create sustained bipartisan or just sustained change with a significant majority of the legislative branch or a significant majority of the country that, as you said, by nature requires extending into the other side, the other party. That doesn't mean everything is going to be 50-50, right? 50% Republican, 50% Democrat.
Mhm.
But it does mean you have to build a broader array of coalitions, right? Blue Dawn Democrats or whatever the case may be, moderates. In the case of the housing bill, there were plenty of progressives that voted for that too. So those coalitions can look very different, but by and large, I think the point that Yuval and others make is you're likelier to be successful in the long term on big challenges the broader your coalition ultimately is.
Yeah, and it is going to be, more accepted by voters. It is less likely to be overturned because like so that the broader the approval for something, like the more stable it is. And stability is kind of actually something that we should
Very valuable to
value. Yeah,
us.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's very, very valuable. So I want to shift to talk about unions because this weekend I actually thought about you. Each time I hear anything about union, I think of you. And I don't know if you've seen this story about Alex Tavarok at Marginal Revolution put out a piece saying that the data showed that the self driving cars were like a big, big, big group pushing against having self driving cars were trial lawyers. And I don't know if you've seen that story. Like it went online, and which like makes some sense, not for us and not morally, but because trial lawyers benefit a great deal about going and suing the automobile industry for any defect. But it's I say not morally because there are like 37,000 to 40,000 people who die on on the roads every year. But anyway, so and this other guy, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Bree Shaw, said, well, yeah, try lawyer, yes, but actually the biggest opponent of self-driving cars and automated vehicles are unions, and he kind of shows the data. So I thought I thought of you, and if you've seen, I don't know if you've seen this, but anyway, I was writing my column and I thought kind of, it seems to me to be a reflection of kind of a strategic mistakes that unions have been making over and over and over again, which is kind of like they're trying to preserve jobs as they existed without understanding that, as tasks are automated, it doesn't mean the jobs disappear. And in fact, if unions were a healthy, functioning body, what they would do is actually not try to save jobs as they were, the last 100 years, but actually kind of as they're going to be, and try to really deliver a service for their workers. And I just kind of wanted to ask you, kind of, how do you think this fit in your whole understanding of unions?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think it's indicative, to your point, of a flaw in how they think about their environment and their own prospects. Like, obviously, the status quo is not working for organized labor in the private sector. Union density has declined enormously from the 1970s down to it's just about 6.5% in the private sector today. The reason for that is that people increasingly see less and less value from them. However, the manner in which they have responded is to basically try to tilt the playing field further in their favor by either stopping technological innovation or reclassifying independent contract workers and things like that to become, able to be unionized. The data is very clear on this. AFL-CIO and others, they spend far, far more on politics and advocacy than they do on organizing and representing new workers, right? We might oppose a particular union organizing effort at Starbucks or Amazon or something, but at least that's the thing unions are supposed to be doing, right? Going out
Hmm.
and organizing workers to represent their interests. They actually spend a very small portion of their overall hundreds of millions of dollars on that and more on what we're talking about, tilting the playing field, reclassifying workers, passing things like the PRO Act, which would, ban right to work laws and, and allowed for unionization without workers ever voting in secret on it. But the connection between those two things, Bureau, is that ultimately they have no reason to evolve until they become more democratic, right? Unions, as you and I have discussed before, are completely undemocratic. Their preference is to be undemocratic, right? They want to be able to organize workplaces without a secret ballot election. They want everyone to be forced to be, dues paying members of the union. There's a number of different, they don't want as much financial transparency as the federal government requires of them through the Office of Labor Management Standards. And so the undemocratic nature of unions makes their incentives entirely backwards. If they were willing to give up that model of coercion and be responsive to workers, it would force them to do the kinds of things that would actually make them valuable to workers, right? I think there actually is a model of unionization in this country that could be very healthy in a 21st century technologically advanced country
Right.
that
Yeah.
needs robust civil society organizations, right? Unions could be vehicles to provide benefits, to provide workforce development and job training. They obviously have been an important vehicle for civil society, community building, but they can't be any of those things if their model is entirely based on forcing people to be a part of their organization and pay them against their will.
And also, like the other thing with they're just kind of wrong is wanting jobs to all be like 9 to 5 jobs like in the 1950s, because most of, like, I mean, the growing share of the type of jobs are independent workers, and what independent workers are valuing is actually the flexibility that comes with independent work. The fact that the fact that you precisely don't have to be at work from 9 to 5, that you can pick your own hours, that you can, there's just all sorts of things. And it's kind of really crazy to see the union's efforts to grab on this growing segment of the labor force, but their response to this is like, let's try to make that labor force looking exactly that like that other labor force that they don't want to look like. And it's so, I mean, it is so problematic because there's so much that they could actually provide for that labor force.
Yeah, I just had your Mercatus colleague, Leah Palagashvili, on a panel on Capitol Hill. We had probably 50 or 60 Hill staff in the room talking
Yeah,
about
last week,
this
right?
last week, and it was a great conversation because she presented exactly that data, right? So much of the conversation, particularly Hill staff, hear and see is, oh, the system is rigged, corporations are woke and progressive. We need workers to be able to have a voice and stand up. some of which has some validity to it as far as the importance of workers being able to have a voice in their workplace. But the data simply doesn't bear out that unions are reflective of the priorities of workers today. One of the data points she loves to point to is the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that 80% of freelance workers, workers who are 1099, lack the protections of W-2 employment, they prefer that freelance status for all the reasons you mentioned, as far as the flexibility, the ability to have a sense of entrepreneurship, build your own schedules, and all these things. There are still things that workers need, right? Benefits and healthcare and retirement accounts and all these things. The fact that they are seen as mutually exclusive, that unions need you to be a full-time W-2 employee, able to be unionized under the National Labor Relations Act. Otherwise, they think you shouldn't be allowed to get any of those things from a business that you work with. I mean, that just shows the complete separation from reality that workers have about the 21st century economy.
Yeah, no, it is. It's kind of quite remarkable. And I was thinking about this when I was like looking. I mean, I wasn't surprised to see that unions were like basically the ones spending the most money opposing, driverless cars and trucks and. But I was because they just lack this imagination when there's actually so much they could be doing. So if you had your way, like if what would you how would you transform unions? And by the way, it's kind of also interesting. I'm thinking about your lower income worker thing. It's like there's this conception that that's who unions are representing, but the truth of the matter, since like I think half, like 50% of it's mostly they represent government employees, and they represent a lot of government employees with a lot of college degrees, right? It's like unions really aren't really, I don't know, is this correct to say they're not mostly representing actually lower income workers? Is that
It,
correct?
yeah, well, the thing is, you look at an example like the UAW, right? The United Auto Workers. Who would you imagine the United Auto Workers represents? Workers that work
Oh,
in
yeah, yeah.
auto plants would be a reasonable
Yeah, yeah.
assumption. They've had an enormous growth. I think more than 100% since 2012. A significant portion of the UAW workforce are graduate students on college campuses. So
Yeah.
they simply have ceased to become the thing that they were setting out to originally be, that they were at one point. And I think there's a number of reasons for this. I think that it's increasingly become, as I was alluding to, a hyper partisan, ideological, progressive thing rather than a vehicle that's actually intended to serve workers on the bottom half with things that are actually valuable to them. Let me give you another very good example of this. So another person you had speak on the panel last week is a man by the name of Michael Alcorn. He's been a Trader Joe's employee, just a line employee in Trader Joe's for more than a decade up in Massachusetts, blue state. Michael is not a conservative. He's not like a right wing person in any respect. Um, didn't like the manner in which the union came in for a couple of reasons. One, the union wanted to organize the workplace without a secret ballot election, right? You got 30% or X number to sign the card of union interest. They took those signatures to Trader Joe's and said, look, more than half your workforce signed these cards. We want you to recognize our union without ever having a secret ballot election. Didn't like that. Didn't like the manner in which they were going about representing the employees, right? There was no accountability for the leadership. Another thing they did, all of a sudden they were purposely injecting really hot button sort of social and cultural issues into the collective bargaining negotiations with Trader Joe's. Things about covering gender affirming care and abortion care and all these things. And Trader Joe's is a progressive company. Their response was, oh, regardless of the progressive values of these things, they're already covered in the health plan that Trader Joe's already provides to our employees. These things have no business being part of a collective bargaining negotiation, but the union wanted to inject all these sort of progressive, flagpole items because that's what was important to them, right? You often see conversations around supporting Israel or supporting Palestine in collective bargaining negotiations. You see speakers from the SEIU speaking at rallies for these things all the time. These things have nothing to do with the day to day priorities of working class, lower income people, which is why you've seen this mass abandonment from organized labor in the private sector. And again, it all goes back to the lack of democracy in unions, right? They are simply not accountable in a democratic way to the workers they claim to represent. And if they were willing to improve that, it would improve their lot a lot, I think, going forward.
Are they, I mean, so but that's kind of probably a product of the fact that they spent so much of their money on political organizing, right? I mean, it's just like they they give so much of their money to Democrats. So in a way, I mean, I guess this is the nature of the beast, right? I mean, like if I remember correctly, the last election, though many of their workers actually supported Trump, a bunch of the unions just refused to endorse Trump. I mean, if they weren't like endorsing anyone, that'd be kind of one thing, but like they're, yeah,
And there's an important distinction here, Mira. Nobody is saying that unions shouldn't have a voice in the political process. They have a First Amendment
yeah,
right as
yeah,
an organization like
yeah,
anybody
of
else
course.
does. There's two problems here. One, in almost half the states, they can force workers to pay dues, which are then used for a variety of advocacy causes, and money is sent to all kinds of different ideological and political organizations. And so that's, I would argue, a violation of the First Amendment
Hmm.
protections for workers. The other is, as you mentioned, it's simply a distraction from their priorities.
Yeah,
Um, and I think you're starting to see this where for a long time, they've been able to spend enough money on the progressive left supporting Democrats that Democrats are largely beholden to organized labor. Again, regardless of what it means for actual workers. Let me give you a very concrete example of this before I get to what's happening on the right with organized labor. It behooves workers to be able to see how union leaders are spending their money, right? That's a very pro worker reform. There should be, I spend $1,000 a year on union dues. I want to see how my union is spending that money. There's a law called the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act, the LMRDA, also known as Landry-Griffin. It was passed in 1959 after a variety of union scandals, corruption scandals in the early 20th century. Unions oppose increasing the transparency requirements on themselves to see how union dues are being spent. That is a place, and Democrats agree with them, that is distinctly protecting entrenched union leadership at the expense of workers. But Democrats won't bat an eye on that issue, right? We know the reason for that, right? Because the unions support them politically. What we're starting to see happen, I think, on the Republican side is a little bit is union leaders have recognized that a lot of rank and file workers are more culturally conservative, socially conservative, whatever the case might be. Um, and so they're starting to see an opportunity or maybe even a need to start to talk to Republicans, but they're not changing anything ultimately about the model of unionization, right? They're saying, oh, maybe if we can support some Republicans politically, they'll get on board with us and sort of our coercive old 20th century model. The unfortunate thing is that I think we're starting to see some of that actually play out in real time, right? With people like Senator Josh Hawley, Vice President Vance, and others who won't bat an eye at union democracy, right? They never speak out in favor of right to work or secret ballots or any of these things. All they do is talk about how great unions are and how we need to empower them further. But again, it comes at the expense of working class people, people they claim to represent, who have been abandoning unions for decades because of that lack of democracy. And so we're kind of seeing those political incentives go both ways. And the perspective that's being lost is the pro worker, pro freedom perspective. And that, of course, is what we try to inject at FREOPP and elsewhere.
so if you had your way, like so what's the free op kind of way of reforming unions?
Yeah, I think I would start. There's a piece of legislation called the Employee Rights Act, and basically is an omnibus of pro freedom reforms to organized labor. I've worked on this bill in many different capacities. When I was at AFP, I was on the House Education and Workforce Committee as kind of the lead staffer on this. It would, for one thing, protect the ability of states to enact right to work laws. It would not touch right to work laws. It would guarantee the right to a secret ballot. It would guarantee that a worker gets to choose what method of communication a union has to be able to reach them. You can give, just a phone number, just an email address. Right now, Democrats, the PRO Act, they want to require workers to give all kinds of personal information. It would protect the ability of franchisees to be small business owners. It would protect the ability of independent contractors to keep their freelance status. It would protect against, right now unions have a carve out for union violence, which is kind of crazy to think about. So there's a number of just worker
What does it
protections.
mean? What does it mean?
So right now, there's essentially something called the Hobbs Act exemption that certain instances of violence in the course of union organizing and negotiations are actually protected under law. So I'll give you a very concrete example of this. There was a famous actress, actually. She was hosting a show in Boston, and building the set for this show was done by non union labor. Unions were picketing, striking, doing things that they have the right to do in these situations. They went and vandalized the set for this show, and it was protected under law because it was done in the course of union
Sounds
speech,
like
essentially.
qualified immunity for
Yeah,
politicians,
exactly.
which kind
That's
of like brings about also kind of the connection between like,
Let me give you another really concrete. This is not a violence example. Another place where unions have this kind of protection. It's what we like to call the Battle of the Sevens. It's the Section 7 of the National Labor Relations Act and Section 7 protections or Title 7 protections under the Civil Rights Act. So, as you know, the Title 7 protections are the protected classes in the workplace, right? You cannot face discrimination on the basis of race, sex, etc. The Biden National Labor Relations Board ruled that unions Section 7 speech protections under the National Labor Relations Act supersede the Civil Rights Act, meaning unions, and this happened in real life, that engaged in really heinous speech against an employee, sexist, racist, really discriminatory, really awful stuff because employees were opposing the union. The NLRB ruled those employees that were part of the union organizing effort could not be fired for that speech, even though normally an employer would obviously fire you for that kind of behavior because it's abhorrent and it violates the Civil Rights Act. The Biden NLRB on two different occasions said that they cannot be fired for that behavior because it's protected speech under the National Labor Relations Act. These are the kinds of things that I would start with when it comes to making unions more accountable, more transparent, more democratic. Ultimately, I think that does more to serve the interests of workers in the workplace. And then from there, I think it opens the door to a number of kind of more concrete sort of economic upward mobility oriented opportunities for unions, such as benefits and workforce development and things like that.
yeah, that's, I mean, I wish that you guys are good. I mean, I really hope you guys are going to succeed. But then, like, tell us what's happening with the right and unions right now.
Yeah, I was saying this a couple minutes ago, but increasingly, as they see more and more working class people becoming solid members of the Republican coalition, they're seeing a need to engage Republicans. But what they're doing is using political influence just to bring Republicans more towards the coercive union side
Yeah,
of the issue. Now, to be very clear, this is a very, very small minority of
yeah,
Republicans. The
yeah.
vast majority have been rock solid on this issue for decades, and they continue to be. But there's sort of
Which is
two.
that they don't oppose private unions, and but they also want to protect workers who don't want to sign up for unions. So they're generally pro right to work act, yeah,
Yes,
for
yes,
whatever
and many
reason.
of them come from states that have had right to
Yeah,
work laws on the books for 70, 80
yeah,
years,
yeah,
which have never been questioned. But you're seeing, like I mentioned, Hawley, Vance. So you've got kind of this red state Republican that's kind of becoming more pro-union. And then you've, of course, got kind of the purple state, purple district, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania Republicans that are more pro-union, which is a little bit more understandable just given the union density is higher, the populations are a little bit, less conservative, more open to unionization. That's been the case in purple district members for a long time. These kind of more red state, red district members being open to unionization conversations or union policy, I think is concerning. We saw this just recently with a bill called the Faster Labor Contracts Act. And I won't get into the details, but basically what this bill would do is after an employer recognizes a union, right now the law gives them, a certain runway to go back and forth and reach an agreement. The FLCA would say that after a certain point, that is actually taken out of the hands of the union and the employer. They are no longer negotiating with themselves, with each other. It would insert federal bureaucrats from a body called the FCMS, the Federal Mediation and FMCS, Federal Mediation and Conciliation Services, to come in and impose a contract on that workplace via federal bureaucrat. You've seen a bunch of these kind of populist Republicans support that, and then some of these purple district Republicans support that bill. So it's that it actually passed the House, obviously with every Democrat supporting and a handful of Republicans. And again, I think the this is a long way of saying that we need to be really, really clear. If the interest politically of Republicans is to be pro-worker, we need to be really, really clear on what that means. And it's not that pro-worker means being pro-union. Pro-worker means being actually pro-worker, protecting and defending the rights of workers and the freedoms they have within labor law, the freedom they have to work in employment settings and arrangements that work for them, and to build an economy ultimately that gives them the opportunity to uplift themselves and afford the necessities of life, like workforce training, housing, healthcare, education, all the things that we've discussed elsewhere.
yeah. And it's striking, especially because precisely workers are the one moving away from moving away from unions, and so this is kind of it's a weird time to do this. But that, yeah, but at the same time, it's very consistent with something that is something else that's happening on the left with the Democratic Socialist of America. When you look at their rise, and you've written about this, their rise in American politics, which would have been inconceivable, right? Like a few decades ago, or like even 10 years ago, 5 years ago. Like, the people who vote for them are not those low income workers. They're they're not. And so it's like you had a piece where, actually, give us that story where you compared some of JD Vance, the vice president's comments against free market, to saying he agrees with a lot of Democratic Socialist of America's comments, and why they're wrong. But it's also kind of really interesting when you think about the worker. This is meant, these kind of, like, highly educated, very elite kind of politicians who are pretending to represent workers, really aren't, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, the piece I wrote is the Vice President Vance and the Democratic Socialists, they basically share the same skepticism of free market capitalism. They come at it from different social and cultural beliefs, but ultimately they both believe that capitalism is incompatible with the moral order as they see it, and that could not be more wrong. Nor is it reflected by their particular voter bases on each of the parties. And so the mistake that they both make, and I'll get to the politics and the voting coalitions in a second, but the complaint you hear a lot is that free markets deprive people of dignity and they don't facilitate human flourishing and all this stuff. That puts way, way, way too much onus on a free market economy and on government that should never be there in the first place. Free markets are a vehicle for agency. They are the thing that allow you to build the life that you desire. And they are the thing that guarantees that the circumstances of your birth do not determine the circumstances of your life, that you can start in one place and rise to another. And in doing so, it makes more accessible and more affordable the things you need to live and to prosper that are economic in nature, like healthcare, like housing, like employment. Those things create agency and they are an aspect of human flourishing, but they are not all of human flourishing. This is the thing I think both Vance and the DSA miss, right? Which is that a free market economy nor the government will ever take the place of faith, family, friends, community, robust civil societies, neighborhoods, people that look out for each other. Those things, in many respects, have nothing to do with a free market economy, but they are ultimately the things that create meaning and value in our lives. I think Vance is actually a particularly interesting example of this because he wrote very eloquently in Hillbilly Elegy that those were the things that were missing in his childhood, right? In a broken home in Appalachia, he saw the consequences of those sort of social and cultural factors of human flourishing missing, and people pay the price for it. It's unfortunate now he has kind of transformed as he's risen politically into this place where political and economic grievance is something to be addressed by the heavy hand of government to just redistribute wealth to one particular class of voters, as though that's going to ultimately facilitate widespread human flourishing via government control of the economy. I think we see the same thing on the far left with the DSA, who obviously are just not fans of the American experiment as it exists today, as it existed for 250 years. But the distinction that you're drawing, Vero, is you would think that they're out there talking about uplifting the most low income people, the people most in need of economic mobility, opportunity, and affordability. But it's such a ridiculous kind of pie in the sky vision that it doesn't actually work on the ground. What we have seen over and over and over again in Democratic primaries is that, still progressive, but more establishment progressives end up doing much better in precincts that are made up of less educated, more minority, Black and Hispanic heavy voters. And these DSA socialist candidates end up overperforming in precincts that are much more white and more highly educated. Because ultimately, people that are actually struggling to make ends meet, they need real results because they have real deadlines. They don't have time for Marxist wish casting like the folks in the DSA are doing. And ultimately, all that to say, I think these sort of abstract visions of what government should do to create human flourishing that both Vance and the DSA are pushing simply do not meet the needs of people in real time. And I think people feel that in a very concrete way that they want government to make life more affordable and create space for these non government, non economic aspects of human flourishing, like family, faith, and community, to be more prevalent in people's lives.
I remember reading that in New York, in the Mamdani versus Cuomo versus that like black voters voted for Cuomo, and lower income workers voted for Cuomo, and it's kind of like it's a real irony. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we've seen that time and again. We saw that in those congressional primaries. We saw it when AOC first upset Joe Crowley. We saw it in the 2016, or excuse me, the 2020 presidential primary on the Democratic side, right? Jim Clyburn and black voters basically saved the candidacy of Joe Biden in that primary. We see this play out over and over and over again where, um, low income black voters are a core part of the Democratic coalition. They want real results right now, and they overwhelmingly reject these kind of elite, far left Marxist TSA candidates.
Where do you think the future of the Democratic Party is?
Yeah, this is a good question. It's something we're going to look more into at FREOPP. Obviously, as you know, we do our conference in November, and
Mhm.
we're looking forward to a conversation there. But given our desire for productive bipartisanship at FREOPP, we think a healthy center left in this country is important. It's an important thing to have, given a country that's essentially 50-50. We want there to be a robust and healthy center left. I think they have some work to do to reaffirm their control over the Democratic Party. Right now, all of the energy is on these far left, I would argue, sort of anti-American DSA Marxists. I don't know how they overcome that. I think the progressive grassroots are, and we've seen reams and reams of data about this, and I'm happy to share some examples offline, but on issue after issue after issue, and even on their prioritization of issues, far left Democratic, reliable Democratic primary voters are simply out of step with the vast majority of Americans, and it's pulling the Democratic Party away from a path towards victory. I think ultimately what leaders of the Democratic Party need to do is think hard about what a winning coalition looks like. To get back to the top of our conversation, what does a winning majority coalition look like for their party? I think ultimately what they'll see is they kind of need to jettison the DSA crowd being in the driver's seat of their party.
Right, and then the worry, of course, is that in the same way as the rise of Trump and the MAGA movement have actually, you know, m- made the Democratic Party less healthy and more radical, and maybe it's just kind of a direct. There's a direct link between the rise of the whatever the Trump coalition is with the rise of the DSA now, unhealthy left wing party is not going to help and bring about like the kind of change that we need on the right to go back to something that is not just nuts. So
It's
it's
it's very true, and I think there's another point here worth making for folks on the right as well. Trump obviously came in on a populist wave, but by and large, the most popular things he did were pretty traditional free market reforms, right? Deregulation, tax cuts, nominating Federalist Society judges to the Supreme Court and things like that. The things that have hurt him politically are populist in nature, right? The trade tariffs are obviously the top of that list. Affordability is concern number one. It's absolutely crushing him. To even get back to labor, Vero, he's sort of seen as this pro worker guy. You know what he's never been? Is pro union. Last campaign cycle in 2024, one of the major unions asked President Trump if he would disavow support for right to work, and he refused to do so. He refused to say that he opposes right to work. And yet, because of the manner in which he conducts himself and his work on other issues and things we don't need to get into, he still commands almost 40% support or 40% support from union households. I think there's a lesson there for Republicans, right? Which is that, and particularly Vice President Vance, he is never going to recreate the Trump coalition by becoming an economic progressive. That's a
Well,
really, really
because
critical thing to know.
there's already a party that does this.
Exactly. He's never going to out economic progressive the Democrats. That's not what President Trump did. And so I think the future of what the Republican coalition looks like is also up for grabs. And Republicans have work to do to reaffirm their support of upwardly mobile suburbanites and parents and things like that. So I think both sides have questions, and the top down government economic progressive extremism is harmful for both parties politically, and of course, it's harmful for the country as a whole.
Yeah. Before we go, I wanna ask you to tell us what are you guys thinking about to I mean, people have concerns about the state of the family, the state of communities, the state of the union. It's like, so what's you guys just launched a big project on that front. So what just tell us what you guys are
Yeah.
thinking about, not
Yeah. Let
only
me,
maybe for why you're doing this and but like so that kind of how you go about thinking about these issues and whether you have kind of concrete policies that you guys are pushing.
yeah. Yeah. So we're at the very early stages of this. And then we're not the first ones to do this, but there's a bridge that we're trying to build, which is that we often in DC, especially, look at policy through the lens of there's economic policy and then there's kind of social cultural policy, and the two have nothing to do with each other. That distinction does not exist in real life. And it is particularly harmful for our audience at FREOPP, for folks on the bottom half. You and I both know that there are social and cultural factors, individual decision making and behaviors that have an enormous impact on upward mobility. And we need to be able to clearly state that there are rights and wrongs when it comes to individual behaviors and decisions made. Let me give you a very clear example of this. I'm sure you've seen something called the success sequence. The success sequence that was work done by Brad Wilcox down at UVA. No matter your starting point in life, for a young person who does the following three things in order: they graduate high school, they get a job, and they get married before having kids, their odds of being in poverty are near zero. They're less than 3%. And that holds no matter what you control for, whether you come from a single parent household, no matter your race, whether you're urban, rural, poor, whatever the case may be. If you do those three things in order, you are virtually guaranteed to be in the middle class or better. That is a set of value judgments about individual decisions that we have to be willing to say have objective rights and wrongs. That's something we're willing to do at FREOPP because it has such serious implications for upward mobility. And now, what are we doing about that? First, we're actually diving into the particulars. Last summer, we did a paper specifically on the impacts of marriage on anti-poverty. Of course, out of wedlock childbirth itself is a driver of generational poverty, but for two poor adults, can marriage help them escape poverty? And oftentimes it can. It's not overwhelming the impact, but it can be a helpful force. We have another paper coming out later this year on how to reinvigorate civil society, right? At what Tocqueville talked about, right? All these little platoons and sort of the non-government institutions of society that are a really critical aspect of human flourishing have kind of been pushed out of the way by government. People have become atomized because of, a variety of factors, technology and all these other things that have kind of atomized people away from human interaction with one another. How do we kind of reinvigorate that? We're going to start getting more into family policy as far as, can we make childcare more affordable, more accessible? Can we make it less intimidating to have children and raise a family because it's so expensive? I think that's a big thing holding us back. We've talked about fertility in the past, right? Just we need more babies in this country. Our, fertility rate has declined, marriage rates are declining, people are waiting too long to get married, things like that. So these feel like social and cultural topics, but they have an enormous impact on anti-poverty efforts. They have an enormous impact on the education of kids, right? How involved their parents are. They have an enormous impact. We'll give you the last example on something like the foster care child welfare system. We just launched a huge initiative called the Center for Safe and Stable Futures on child welfare. A big thing we want to do is reinvigorate the role of family in civil society in making sure kids are stable, right? Government can keep kids safe, take them out of a
The
dangerous
marriage
home. It will never set them up for success in adulthood the way stable families and civil society can do. And so while these feel like values oriented issues are social and cultural, at FREOPP, we're no longer drawing that distinction between the two because there are an enormous set of those
Yeah.
issues that impact economic opportunity and
Yeah.
upward mobility.
A few weeks ago, I wrote a column at Creators, and it was based on a few chapters at the Land of Opportunity book that AEI put out, and it was on the marriage penalty of a lot of welfare program, and it was there was a one of the chapter they had was on the decline in marriage and the outcome, basically the impact that existed for the kids that grew up in one parent families. And Melissa Kearney at Notre Dame has done as from kind of the left of center, has written this book, The Two Parents Privilege, and and it is, I think there is kind of a realization that we need to start talking about this. And one of my recommendation in there was like to really kind of actually not shy away from, because the AI chapters were really kind of like, hence we need to reform these programs. But I actually think sometimes there's no reforming these programs. Actually, the program themselves is kind of create these disincentive to be married. And as such, we have to be courageous and say that we need to get rid of these programs. It's like, and it's kind of it's hard for a lot of people to recognize that there's no fixing. There's this kind of like, there's no fixing a government program. And often when there's a marriage penalty, there's also there's a labor supply penalty. And of course, this is kind of a like kind of a hard it's a hard message now to the MAGA right, who kind of, some of them want to go back to the 1950s where women weren't working and all this. But nonetheless, I mean, we have to be willing to talk about all this. And I'm just really happy you guys are doing it.
Yeah, yeah. Let me give you one last data point. And again, it comes from the center left. I think it was Raj Shetty that said, so we already know that the single biggest predictor of generational poverty is out of wedlock childbirth, right? As you mentioned, that the two parent privilege is enormous. One of the greatest predictors of upward mobility is simply how much you interact with people outside of your socioeconomic class. So if you're poor, the extent to which you're able to build real relationships with people in higher socioeconomic status, I think he wrote is the most strongly correlated factor to whether you actually climb the socioeconomic ladder. And so these are all things that, again, to your point, have to do with family formation, the strength of civil society and community interaction and community connectivity and all of that. So again, it's just we're well past time that we treat economic issues and some of these social, cultural, and family issues as separate from one another because they have enormous impact on each other.
Yeah, yeah, and like one of the things that's worth saying is like the reason why Melissa Carney wrote this book, The Two Parents Privilege, and she's specifically talking to the left, is because she said we have to recognize that there is such a thing of like that kids who are raised by two parents, they fare much better than those who aren't. And she was saying, and unfortunately, those who actually could need the stability the most are actually the socioeconomic class that ends up often not having two parents, the lower income Americans. So she was like, it's the alarm. If it was spread around income classes, you could lament it and say, you know what, it's better for kids. But on top of that, it's the double whammy, which is kind of it's these kids who could use the most actually, like this stability that's brought on by two parents being around are the ones who actually often don't have that.
And Tim Carney writes where progressives often do the exact opposite. While they preach, oh, there's no such thing as values, doesn't matter, do whatever you want, this sort of like
Yeah, yeah.
libertine, no rights and wrongs, by and large, the place with the strongest two-parent families and strongest civil society are the bluest communities in our country, right?
Hmm.
Bethesda, Maryland, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Palo Alto, California. I mean, like, these are places where you see the two-parent privilege and robust civil society and the fruits of those things for the kids that grow up in those communities. And so you've got this hypocrisy on the progressive left where there is a refusal to actually exercise value judgments that are objectively right and wrong.
Hmm.
And I think to your point, this isn't a problem exclusive to like urban blue communities. These problems exist deeply in red America, rural America too. And I think, to the extent that Republicans are talking to their own voters, their own people, they need to be willing to say so too. So I think it's just a matter again of not only drawing that connectivity, but and frankly, to be totally honest, we see this a lot in classical liberal libertarian crowds as well. Like being willing to make value judgments is absolutely critical to economic opportunity and upward mobility. You know, our mutual friend Stephanie Slade writes about this. Other people have been willing to say this, but we just need to get past the point of discomfort where we can't make affirmative value judgments about right and wrong. Because as you know, people, particularly on the bottom half of the socioeconomic ladder, are paying the price for our inability to do so.
Well, I think this is a great place to end. Thank you so much, Akash. It was just a lot of fun.
Yes, always good to be with you, Vera. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.